I love the story that Nadia Bolz-Weber tells in one of her books about, her husband calling her out. She came home ranting about stupid people at her church, right? And their stupid ideas. And so, he said to her, remember that anytime you draw a line in the sand, Jesus is always on the other side of that. And so I think that's got to be our attitude about this. That every time we do that, we're actually working against the values of Jesus.
Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chakowski, and I'm the worship director for Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is our lead pastor, Julie Richter. Hello, Julie.
Hey, Eric. How's it going?
Very well, thank you.
Good. We've been in this sermon series called Labels, and it has been a great series as well as a great series of conversations that we have had here on the podcast, and today is no different. Today we are talking about social labels, so labels like homophobe and racist and sexist. And these labels are really important for us to talk about in the ways in which we divide one another into categories and maybe even get into our ideological bunkers. And so today we're going to have a conversation with someone that's going to talk to us about how we not only strip away these labels, but how we look past not only labels, but brands and see each other as people first beyond those labels.
And I think one of the tendencies for us in society is to be really this or that, black or white, polarized, left or right, and that there's really no middle ground ideologically or no room for a deeper part of the story or a deeper part of somebody's personality or beliefs. And so we really want to have a conversation today, or maybe even make the argument that it's vital to be willing to go deeper into finding out who people are rather than categorizing them into specific camps just based on one or two particular things that they do or believe.
Absolutely. So today we have a great conversation with Bart Patton, and we're going to dive into these social labels and how we can move past them.
Well, we are here with Bart Patton. Bart is the Director of Youth and Young Adult Education at Perkins School of Theology at SMU here in Dallas. And Bart is also with his family, a member of the Access community. And we are really excited to welcome you to the podcast today, Bart. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah. So give us a little bit of context. I just told everybody what you do, but give us a little bit of context for what that means in your role currently, professionally, and maybe what led you to this point.
So it's the greatest joy and honor of my life to do what I get to do right now. And after 20 years serving the church as a youth minister, as an associate pastor, what I do is kind of leverage the theological education and resources of Perkins School of Theology for those in youth ministry and for those serving the church through Office of External Programs. So lots of fun working with youth workers and those who love young people and those who love the church.
Excellent.
Well, it's a really interesting time to be doing that in youth ministry and especially with young adults right now, as there's this sort of mass exodus, maybe we could call it, of young adults in the church. Sure. And so to be able to talk to leaders about that right now is a really important conversation.
So we are, as you know, in the midst of a series called Labels, and last Sunday, JB preached on social labels, which is a hard topic. Labels like racist or bigot or homophobe or sexist. Why do you think labels exist? And specifically, why do you think these social labels exist?
I think it's part of us trying to find our identity and really maybe our tribe. I think it's tribalism deep down, right? If we can figure out our place, if we can figure out our people, if we can figure out who our people aren't and who they are, I think there's a false sense of comfort that comes from that. I've been rereading Vonnegut this summer, and so I'm real taken with, in Cat's Cradle, this idea that he puts forward about having a kavas, this divinely appointed network of people. It's our circle, and whether we like it or not, we stumble upon this circle. And how we accomplish, of course, in this made-up religion in Cat's Cradle, how we accomplish divine will is to work in our kavas towards something greater. But later in the book, he says that there are granfalloons, which are our attempt to kind of create those kvass networks. And I think that the social labels are that kind of attempt, right? And so Vonnegut says that like class of 86 or, like you're a Hoosier, I'm a Hoosier,
class.
right? Like those kind of things are grand
falloons.
falloons.
Better than your school.
We're at the center of those networks. We're trying to create those networks. And so even though for Vonnegut, they're social observations and in the book, they're part of a fictional religion, I think it's a real keen observation on how we construct things. And I think when you lean into God's plan for your life, you find this really incredible network of people that you're connected with globally and across generations. But we attempt, I think, at every level to try to create those networks for ourselves with us in the center of those. And so I think those labels help us do that in a negative way. And there's probably some positivity in those constructions, especially in adolescence, right, to try to find where you fit. But for the most part, they're propped up networks. And we don't accomplish a lot through them. We just try to form identity through them.
Yeah, it sounds like both sides of the same coin, right? In one side, community can create belonging and can help you understand yourself or help create identity. But on the other side, it can put you into these ideological bunkers and political bunkers and social bunkers where you end up only surrounding yourself with people who are just like you and think just like you. And then the counter to that is that it creates this us versus them. And so I'm an us and you're a them because you're in a different category or even a different community than I am. And so if you're different from me, then you become the villain in some way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So talking about both sides of the coin, both of you have mentioned that there's potentially some positivity to finding some identity in these areas. But when we label folks, I think there's a tendency for there to be some misconception for the them, right? So Bart, do you see any misconception that go kind of hand in hand with these social labels?
I think that the minute we embrace those labels, we immediately, like Julie says, we're in a box. And so even the labels we create for ourselves, I think we feel limited by. And so the misconception is that we are that thing and that thing only. Right. So we're defined by it. And so I think there are seasons where we could get joy from that. We could find comfort in that. But I don't think there's ever a place. If you're growing as a human being, if you're growing spiritually, if you're growing socially, I think you feel discouraged by what that box has done for that growth. So I think the misconception is the label in and of itself, because that's what you become. Like, that's who I am. Instead of what you are or what you believe or what you enjoy, it becomes your brand, so to speak.
And I think the word only is the word that stuck out to me so much because people have tendencies, right? So if you believe X about X, then you must believe Y about Y, right? Except when we make those assumptions and define them as only this, when we really don't dive deeper into either motivations behind why they do the things they do, or the fact that just because you believe X about X doesn't mean you believe Y about Y. And so I think, to me, that's also one of the other misconceptions around these social labels.
So I'm wondering if, even on an individual and personal level, if some of these labels and the ones that we put on one another specifically come from this place of hurt and pain and then injustice. Because racism does exist. Sexism does exist. And so when I think about how frequently we are willing to label someone else as a racist or as sexist or as a homophobe, what we're doing in that, I think for a lot of people, is coming from a place of pain. And so I can only speak from my own experience, but as a female in ministry, when something happens or when someone says something to me that I feel like is based on my gender, it is easier for me to label that other person as, well, you're just being sexist, or you are just sexist, rather than saying, you know, what you said hurt. And I do think that there was some things around gender there that we need to talk about. But instead of doing that, I think it's so much easier just to stick another label on somebody because that's what they're doing to me. And
I think that's the important thing to remember, is to not immediately label that person's identity as sexist, but to say, this statement that you made I took as X, Y, or Z, and I think maybe has some things we need to unpack, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't value your character, or that doesn't mean that I think you're a terrible person, or that doesn't mean also that I think you're a racist, and also that I think you're a bigot, and, because so often it just kind of snowballs into some of those areas.
Right.
I think that's super important for all of us, no matter what label we feel the urge to put on somebody, to be willing to just engage in conversation with them and take it a little bit deeper.
Well, and we don't do that. This is what Brene Brown talks about. We don't do that because it is vulnerable. And it is so hard to be both vulnerable and uncomfortable and to engage willingly in something that might cause conflict. But yet the outcome of that is so much better than the labels that we stick on people that cause this divisiveness.
Yeah.
Well, and those labels build immediate walls. So because you said that about me, or because you categorize me that way, I don't want to walk in a journey with you of healing or redemption or forgiveness or understanding. I just want to build a wall to keep you out.
Yeah.
And so the label keeps you at bay. And it means that because you are that label, then there's no possible way for us to reconcile. I don't want you in my world. I don't want you in my network. And so here's the label. It just bought you a pass out of my network.
So when you talk about the walls, when you talk about the us and them mentality, how do you see Jesus talking about this? I mean, specifically, he speaks so much to those that society casts as villains, as outcasts, as those who kind of live in the margins. So what does Jesus say about this?
I think Jesus eviscerates every opportunity that we might take to say, first and foremost, that Jesus is pro or against something or someone. So the minute that you even think, like as you read the Gospels, the minute you think like, oh, so Jesus is against the teachers of the law. No, not really, right? Or like Jesus is pro teachers of the law. No, not really. Jesus is pro Pharisee. No, Jesus is against the Pharisees. He himself strikes those labels or uses that system. And then I think in the parables, as far as his teaching, the parables for me are where he really embraces that. Because even using words that we translate like as prodigal, and we've really turned a lot of some of his radical teachings and parables into milquetoast, right? Like, so we consider prodigal to be a word that's a good thing, right? It meant in the Greek loose living, right? And so this was not a positive thing. And yet here was a label, or the sheep and the goats, right? So there's these labels. And so I think he jumps after that us-them social label mentality in the parables, even where it doesn't seem obvious, but certainly where it does, like the Good Samaritan. And recently, I discovered that Augustine actually translates in his commentary of the Gospels that Jesus is actually the Good Samaritan in the story. We rush in and place ourselves always as the hero in stories. But if you look at the parables, it's possible that Jesus even uses those labels in an interesting way about himself. Like, well, maybe I'm the Samaritan kind of way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, maybe I'm the outcast.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So can you tell us of a time or of an example of when a label is put on somebody and the effects that that label has?
Yeah, so like 2 or 3 days ago, Dallas Morning News, there was an article about WeWork, which is a SoftBank-backed startup for kind of co-working. WeWork just placed a ban on meat products. And so they will no longer reimburse or deal with or pay for meals having to do with meat. So their preference is to work only with people who are vegetarians or who are vegans. And so their initial press release about this said that it was to reduce their carbon footprint. So they were kind of challenged by that, since the data has changed since the 70s on that. But what the article in Dallas Morning News, the writer was basically saying is that this is where we are today on social labels, even on branding. So this is about building the brand, that WeWork is building a tribe, and they want their tribe to be anti-meat. And so it's even gone to that. We live in a day where even our major brands, like we associate branding and commerce even with the brands we want to be associated with. So, Google's ban in reaction to the NRA recently, right? So like we'll say, well, I want that brand in my life because it carries the social labels and identities that I want. And so you've even got that with food shaming now.
Right.
And even my own kids. Like this year, my daughter Becca, 3rd grade, and she came home crying one day because kids in her class had made fun of her for lunch. Well, I'd packed it the night before, and so I'd stuffed it with good stuff, like Twinkies, and so they were like, "Ooh, gross," and so I was like, "This is the best stuff in the world. This is the stuff that like would have made you,
because
enviable, because it wasn't healthy, right?
Healthy.
It wasn't like health. She didn't have carrots and celery.
Yeah, when I was a kid, Twinkies made me popular.
Exactly, right? And
happy.
so there was this food shaming. That's become a thing too. Like, you're not eating healthy, and so even what we eat now has become fodder for that.
Wow.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Bart. And one thing that sort of struck me as you were talking about that too, we have so many IST words or ISM words, right? And so even the nature of that article saying, well, WeWork is now tribalist. Right? Well, that's a label.
Right. Food
right?
Tribalism.
Right.
That's a thing now.
On some level, I'd be interested to know if the contributor went deeper into talking to some of the folks who are making decisions at WeWork to really ascertain, let's talk about some of the motivation. And maybe they did, right? But I think there's even a possibility that some of the labels just get reciprocated towards each other, right? Like, well, you call me this, well, you're just doing this. Well, you call me that, well, you're just doing this, right?
Right.
But it is so interesting that we're almost joking about food shaming right now because it seems like there's no area that's off limits to shame people about, right?
I had just not thought about how much marketing and branding plays such a huge role in this. That's a big eye-opener for me. Because you're right. I mean, it's not just something that we're doing on our own. It's something that the media and all of the brands that we support and buy and use every day are pushing on us. And so even what you choose to buy and what you choose to wear, what you choose to eat, where you choose to live, where you choose to shop, all put labels on you. It's pretty rampant.
My favorite, you talk about who are like the people you'd want to eat dinner with. One of the people on my list, and has been for years, is the marketer who designed the new Dunkin' Donuts logo. It's a few years old now, because I'm amazed that somebody figured out a way to get the icon of a runner into a donut shop icon, right? Like, how did you do that? Like, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And yet it plays to like, oh, there's a runner here, right? Like, even that simple graphic icon. So I think it's about branding, but it's also even about how we identify even things like donuts. Like, oh, well, that's the healthy donut because it's got a runner on it, right?
Right. Clearly.
That makes me feel better.
By the way, I'm not judging anyone for eating donuts. I just want to throw that out there.
Hey, there's no meat in it. There's no meat, right? Like
that's right. Yeah.
A meat donut, that would be a different issue.
I would judge you for that.
Yeah.
But not for the reasons you think.
Oh, man.
All right. So what are some things, or what ways maybe, do you feel like the church has a responsibility to speak in regards to these social labels?
I love the story that Nadia Bolz-Weber tells in one of her books about, her husband calling her out. She came home ranting about stupid people at her church, right? And their stupid ideas. And so, he said to her, remember that anytime you draw a line in the sand, Jesus is always on the other side of that. And so I think that's got to be our attitude about this. That every time we do that, we're actually working against the values of Jesus. And I think Jesus was able to do that because he was full of grace and truth, because he could see to the soul. And we don't look at the soul anymore. We look at the branding. We look at what they're doing or not doing. We look at what we're doing or not doing. We're trying to create that tribe for ourselves instead of embracing that divinely appointed kind of group, that network of people, and embracing a new family. I mean, that's the thing that's upside down about the gospel, is that this divinely appointed church, this church family, becomes a family. I mean, we use that language.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that we have to look at the soul and ask soulish questions and deal in soulish things instead of surface things. And so being full of grace and truth means that even though, like Julie said earlier, someone might hurt you or call you something or say something, we have to understand there's forgiveness and there's something deeper there, that person is not just the label that we would put on them. I think that's super important for the political climate of today. I was talking to a theologian a few weeks ago at the Wild Goose Festival who's notorious for a lot of justice work, and he said to me, I am done with liberals and conservatives. and I'm ready to work with people who will risk embodying the gospel, regardless of those labels. And I think that's where we've got to be. It's where we've got to be always, but especially in the political climate of the day where people, even if had joy, I think, in associating or embracing a certain label for themselves and then go, wait a minute, I didn't mean that. If that's what that looks like, that's not what I'm in for. So I think we're using labels more and more. But there's even folks who might used to have said, I'm evangelical, or I'm Christian, or I'm conservative, who would go, wait a minute, that's not what I meant by that. I'm not in for that.
Which goes back to, if you believe X about X, you must believe Y about Y, right? And
Exactly.
that's just not always the case.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
Part of our mission statement here at the church is to welcome people for Christ. And we talk about that a lot and talk about how we can truthfully not just tolerate people for Christ or, try our best to care for people, but to really embrace people, with open arms when people walk in the door. And so we talk a lot about hospitality. And I heard Suzanne Stabile, who's an author and writer and does a lot of great work, talk one time about if we could shift our understanding of others, instead of putting a label on them, if we could see others as just doing the best that they can. In the same way that, when we walk in the doors of the church and when we are doing whatever we're doing throughout our week, we are doing the very best that we can. And I think if we have that shift of mentality and we see other people as people who are just doing the best they can, I think that might be a way to embody the gospel more through the lens of grace and love, the way that because I think Jesus encountered people and really through that grace and through that understanding, really treated people like they were doing the best they could. Not that they couldn't do better, but that they had a capacity to do more, but through that love that's there first, really treated them as a person first.
In years of youth ministry, I had this illustration that I would use in every youth group I ever led, and I got it from my youth minister when I was 15. It was a powerful illustration, and you take pictures of celebrities out of magazines, and the more random, the better, right? Like, so intergenerational, sometimes Muppets even, like not actual humans, fictional characters. It was always my introduction lesson to every youth group I ever led, and we would have 2 bulletin boards on each side of the room. And so we would say, we're going to vote on what our perfect youth group should look like. And I'd hold up a picture and they would vote either by cheers or jeers, right? Like boos or yays. And if I got more boos and negativity, then I'd rip it up and I'd put it in a trash can on one side. And then if I got yays, I'd put it up on a bulletin board on the other. And so I kept saying, like, this is what your youth group looks like. And so think about the gifts and think about the strengths and the abilities. And so they always wanted Wonder Woman. And they always wanted E.T. Once upon a time, they wanted David Hasselhoff there, but times change, right?
Right.
So now,
Sorry, David.
So, hey, that's the Knight Rider, baby, the Knight Rider. But at the very end, I would have this Sinead O'Connor moment, right? And I would hold up this picture of Jesus, and of course they would cheer, and I'd rip it up. And then there was, shock and awe. It was like, what did he just do? Sacrilege. And I'd throw it in the trash can, and we just kind of leave it there. And then I'd read from Matthew, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And then I would say, my vision, and I think God's vision for the perfect church, the perfect youth group is right here in this trash can. And the last time I did that a few years ago, the last church that I served, I had a young lady who stayed. So after everything was done and I'd cleaned up the youth space, I looked over and she was still there. And she had emptied the trash can out and she'd taken a roll of tape. And she was piecing together with Scotch tape every picture of everyone that we ripped up. And so her father came to pick her up, and I explained what was happening, and we stayed for hours until she, through tears, pieced together everybody that we'd ripped up in that trash can. The last image that she pieced back together was Jesus. And she said, this is the kind of community, this is what I want to be a part of, is a place where we are actively putting people back together and seeing healing as God puts us back together instead of ripping people up and putting people on the bulletin board.
That may be one of the most beautiful illustrations of who the church is called to be that I've heard in a long time.
Absolutely.
Take it, youth ministers and pastors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a communion moment, right?
Right.
Because we say in communion, the body of Christ broken for you. But what we say in the communion liturgy and what Jesus said to the disciples is, as often as you do this, remember me. And that word remember means to put the pieces back together. And I think that that's what we're called to do over and over and over again for people who walk in the doors broken, is to help them find healing and wholeness and to put the pieces back together.
So, Bart, How can the church help people who are struggling with labels that other people have put on them or with labels that they've put on themselves?
I think it'd be revolutionary if in your church community you found a different response, because all of us are going to say something that we wish we would have never said. We're going to feel something we wish we didn't feel. We're going to find ourselves privately or publicly in a place where we deserve a label, right? And so to find a reaction and a response of grace from a community that actually confronts with truth, but that does it with grace. This hurt me, this was offensive, but you are not what you've said, you are not what you've done, you are not what you've eaten or not eaten. You're a child of God. And so there's going to be opportunities for redemption. There's going to be opportunities for restoration. We are not going to build a wall and recoil from you. We're going to embrace you in that moment. And those are the kind of communities that can change the world.
Yeah. So, Bart, we've got one more question for everyone that we have on the podcast. And that question is, at this point in your life, what's one thing that you wish somebody would have told you?
Resurrection takes time. I think I've spent a lot of spiritual disappointment in quick resurrection, and resurrection takes time. So, I found myself with great hope in resurrection. That's my great hope, but also realizing that hope is going to take some time.
That's so important in Access the last 2 years. I guess you can say we've started a tradition, but we light a candle on Easter. And when we start the service, we talk about that. And we say, if you are not someone who feels resurrection right now, if you are somebody who is still in Good Friday, we light this candle for you today. Because you're right, resurrection does take time. And just because Easter Sunday comes doesn't mean that everyone is always there right at that moment. I think that that's a message people need to hear. That's great.
Bart, what a joy it's been to have you. Thank you for your insight and wisdom and stories. It's been, again, just a joy to have you, and we thank you for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
I said it to Bart when he was in the room, but that story he shared about his youth at his previous church who spent hours in tears putting the pieces back together that had been torn up and thrown away reminds us that resurrection takes time, that it wasn't a quick fix, that it wasn't something that was without pain, without suffering, but we were reminded that resurrection makes us whole, that it puts the pieces back together no matter how long it takes.
We want to leave you today with a scripture from 2 Corinthians. It's a scripture that talks about our human point of view and how through Christ we are able to take a new view on ourselves and on others. This is from 2 Corinthians 5:16 through 21. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or on YouTube to not miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Bart Patton for joining us this week, and make sure to tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Marta Frey about political labels. Have a great week.